Pushed out of Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso and now being forced to renegotiate contracts with Senegal and Chad, France is on the back foot in Africa. However, two separate meetings between French President Emmanuel Macron and President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria and his Kenyan counterpart William Ruto suggest Paris could be slowly pivoting towards Anglophone Africa. The decision to hold the 2026 Africa-France Summit in Nairobi further signifies moves towards a strategic recalibration of French policy in Africa. This week on the program, we ask, does France have a new Africa strategy? I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. In just under 5 years, France has seen its influence plummet in its former colonies in Africa. Its military has been forced to withdraw from at least 4 African countries, the latest being Chad, where French forces began their withdrawal on Tuesday. Senegal, too, wants all French military bases in the country closed. CGTN's Robert Nagila has that report.
The end of an era. French forces have begun withdrawing from Chadian soil, concluding 6 decades of French military presence in the country. A day after Chad ended its defense agreement on November 28th, Senegal also called on France to shut down all its military bases and withdraw its troops. Between 2020 and 2023, the French military was forced to leave Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger following military coups in those countries. Besides Senegal, the only other African countries hosting French military bases are Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon and Djibouti. Experts say the current drive is about states' sovereignty.
The perception among most people in West African Francophone countries is the fact that critical decisions about state building, about national progress, about economic development, political development have to be made and backed up by France before they can exercise their own sovereignty. And they consider the fact that the military establishment of France is still operating within their land. That kick them out is the first point to make a point to France that we really want to demand our full independence after 60 years.
French President Emmanuel Macron seems to have taken note of the changing tide. In November, he received proposals from a military review in Africa that could see Paris reduce its military presence on the continent and focus instead on training and logistics with partner states. But many analysts warn that France's influence on Africa cannot be understated.
France's establishment is still so much alive in Francophone countries. Most people are only looking at it from the military establishment alone. French businesses pervade the entire countries that we're talking about here in terms of manufacturing, fast-moving consumer goods in the tourism sector, in the hospitality sector, in the education sector.
So, as Paris is forced to seek new engagement with Africa, experts insist it must engage African countries as equals in a win-win partnership. Robert Nagila, CGTN.
We have a lot to unpack, so let's now bring in our panel of experts, all joining via Zoom. Joining me in Dakar, Oluwale Ojawale, Regional Coordinator, Central Africa Institute for Security Studies. In Johannesburg, we have Arina Morrison, Senior Researcher, Institute for Global Dialogue. And in London, we have Dr. Alex Vines, Head of Africa Program, Chatham House. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining our discussion. Ojawale, I'll begin with you. French influence across Africa has undergone a sharp decline in the last 10 years, particularly in its former colonies. What are the reasons behind this anti-French sentiment?
I think I will start on the note that this has been in the rumble for a long time now. It's just that it is in the recent time, based on the political development in the Sahel in particular, in terms of military taking over the power in those places, and the fact that they need something to rouse their legitimacy. So I think they latch on to that existing tension, grievance among the people, in which most people around the Francophone West Africa believe the reason for their economic underdevelopment is because They are still tied to umbilical cord of France in terms of what they describe as neo-colonialism, in the sense that those countries gain independence, but they probably do not have full economic independence. So I think what we have just seen in the recent time can be explained by two factors. One, the neighborhood effect. My peers are doing it. Let me also try to strike when it is hot. So you see these military dictators in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali exiting their relationship with France, and Chad also doing the same thing. And Senegal, that has always been democratic since independence, which has nothing to do with what is happening in those three countries, also feel like, let us also do it at the time that everybody is talking about this. So I think it is a neighborhood effect. The second factor is political. Most citizens around here believe strategic political decision needs to be sanctioned by France in terms of who becomes the president. And there are people who have also sold out ideas to them in a bid to be able to carry the legitimacy on the part of the people. So I think those are the two forces that makes it to look like they are striking out their relationship with France. But as we progress in this conversation, it is also very important to mention that I think France is still alive and kicking in this country. It is only that they are severing military relationship. In terms of trade and development, France is still present in terms of business establishment, and their elites have all their resources, their education, everything tied to France, which goes to show that decoupling from France is not going to be a tea party.
Right. So, Dr. Vines, what are the implications of this diminishing influence for France geopolitically?
Very eloquently described why this is happening, and so I don't disagree with any of that. France is still active in West Africa and the Sahelian area, but in a very different way, and its military relationship will be much diminished across the African continent, with a few places where it will remain. Djibouti is one where everybody has military bases, including China. That's a place that seems to welcome military bases, foreign ones. So I think what is happening is more multipolarity. So a bit less France, but a bit more United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Iran, Russia. Bear in mind that although Niger has kicked out the French, there are 350 Italian troops providing bilateral training in Niger, and they have not been kicked out, and they have a reasonable relationship with the junta there. So this is complicated stuff. And not only that, but coastal states, for example, have decided, some of them, that they'd like even a better relationship with France. So not very long ago, I think it was in September, Ghana joined as a full member of La Francophonie, for example. So you will see Anglophone countries becoming maybe closer to France, also Lusophone ones. So Angola has become an observer of the Francophonie, for example, which is a pathway to becoming full member. So this is all about choosing and partnering and not being pigeonholed. And I think what Olu said is that the relationship, the neo-colonial relationship between France and particularly West African Francophone countries was too close. And at times the French definitely were over paternalistic, let alone that their security arrangements were not delivering some of the things that people wanted, improving security, for example.
Right. So, Arina, when Emmanuel Macron was elected in 2017, in a bid to boost this declining influence in Africa, he vowed to reset the relationship France had with the continent. So part of the promises he made was that he would increase development aid to African countries. He championed the push to return looted artifacts to Africa, and he also promised to downsize France's military presence. All sounded very good, but why didn't this strategy work?
France's engagement in Africa is to securitize its economic consolidation, essentially, and how it pursues its own internal policies. It's important to remember that. And while it may talk a big game of wanting to have a number of initiatives that improve relations, it's important to remember that a certain amount of anxiety is playing out around the broader European reaction to geopolitics. And so it's also about the strategic position where they possibly feel they no longer are a power broker in Africa, and it's no longer able to influence, as effectively within its own region, perhaps, especially as France is Europe's second biggest economy, especially since Brexit, they wanted to establish themselves as a European financial capital. And so a change in relations creates quite a bit of anxiety in this sense. And so looking back to 2017, when there was so much euphoria about Macron being elected, Macron being the youngest president in French history, and then with time moving on and geopolitics being what they are, of course, things are bound to go back to business as usual.
Okay, so Ojewale, coming back to you, you did mention, of course, that France's economic footprint in Africa is still very, very strong. But now we've also seen traditional allies, like you mentioned, Senegal and Chad. They're pushing to rewrite contracts and review bilateral relations. And of course, at the time when you talked about that strong economic footprint, I mean, we have Total Energy spread across the continent. In West Africa, where you are, we have Canal Plus, which is a big deal when we speak about media. But when you look at these countries that are pushing to rewrite contracts and review their bilateral relations, what are the reasons behind that?
Countries like Senegal and maybe a few countries just came out of election and they made certain political promises to their people. And like I said earlier, you tell the electorate what they want to hear. And part of the things that they said is that the former negotiation that they had was not profiting their people, that the countries that they had, or the businesses, the establishment that they had those contracts with, perhaps maybe those who were in government at that time, perhaps they have ulterior interest and they have a feeling that those negotiations was not really in the larger interest of the country. So it is within their right to renegotiate that to the extent to which they are probably able to get certain concession. We've moved away from the era in which it was based on purely Western dominance of politics, geopolitics, and all those things. A lot of middle power countries are also coming on the scene. And the truth of the matter is that those businesses and interests that they represent are going to be facing stiff competition. But behind this scene is the fact that France is also seen as a country that can exert influence on these countries, particularly when you look at the countries that have continually postponed democratic transition. They know what they are doing. They want to negotiate those transitions in their own time. They even want to drive the transition in their own time. And it is in their best interest that they kick out anybody that can challenge whatever they put on their transition plan. They feel it is in their own interest that they reduce France's influence in their country. But I can argue that with evidence and fact as somebody that is living here, that at best, those statements are rhetorical or they are just paper statements. France is still alive and kicking in these countries. As long as their business interests are here, as long as the elite in this country have significant investment, whether in their property, sending their kids to school in those places. Those are cultural, diplomatic issues that a child that is trained in France, you don't expect that 20, 30 years to come, is probably going to turn away from France. These are soft power demonstrations that France has over this country that I can almost argue that is not going to win in the next 20 years because culture is very, very strong. If you come on the street of Senegal, a few persons will be interested in going to Russia to go and study, for instance. Everybody is going to France. Here, France comes here every day. And when they are coming, they are not just bringing French citizens. They bring Senegalese that are doing businesses in France and all those things. So I think it's more of a political rhetoric. When you look beyond the surface, France is still alive and kicking in this country.
Okay, well, still alive and kicking. However, some movement still very much visible. Dr. Vines, you mentioned the entry of all these other players. So in the face of this movement, how is France adjusting its strategy to maintain its influence in Africa?
So, I mean, multipolarity means a lot more choice, and we all agree on that, and that's good for Africa. So more choice means, negotiating better deals, potentially, because it's more competition also, if you're a wise government. And what's been happening is that the pattern with France, particularly on trade and investment, for many years has been moving away from Francophone West Africa anyway, and moving in, some of the biggest growth markets for France in Africa have been countries like South Africa or Angola or Kenya, for example. So we see this trend, which definitely predates Mr. Macron. It's been a longer-term trend. What I do sense is that France, the Quai d'Orsay, which is their foreign ministry, are really reflecting on how do they redesign their Africa policy. There is an acknowledgement that it has not worked and that it needs to change, both in attitude and objectives, and where are the trade relationships that France will really need to kind of develop in the future. So that's what's happening in France at the moment. There's a period of reflection. Across Europe, we're seeing French diplomats coming to talk to us in a much more humble way, of looking for ideas of how to develop new policy out of Paris. I've not seen something like that before that is as broad and as thoughtful. Business as normal is not possible any longer. And so France is putting a lot more thought into how to re-engineer that. I have a feeling the conclusion will be actually that Africa will become less important for France's foreign policy, although Olu is completely right that the soft power of France will remain immensely powerful. My final point is just look at the guest list who came for the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. You had the creme de la creme of African elites also as part of that invitation list.
And on that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we will explore how France is working to maintain its influence in Africa amid growing resistance from its former colonies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa, and let's continue with the discussion. Still with me, Oluwole Ojowale, Regional Coordinator, Central Africa, Institute for Security Studies. We have Arina Morrison, Senior Researcher, Institute for Global Dialogue, and Dr. Alex Vines, Head of Africa Program, Chatham House. Ojowale, we've heard from Kenyan officials, from French officials as well, about this upcoming France-Africa summit that will be held here in Nairobi, and both sides saying that they're just expanding their relations. But looking back on previous France-Africa summits, how have African countries benefited from these engagements? I mean, what have been the key outcomes out of these summits?
Yes, I think I need to wear my Pan-Africanism cap here because the question is coming home now. And I like the way you frame it. I'm sad in the sense as an Africa that why all these superpowers, even middle powers, are adjusting for the soul of Africa. I found a situation in which it appears like our leaders are not capitalizing on that. And that is the reason why a session of intellectuals within the African continent now are becoming tired about Turkey-African relation, Japan-African relation, the Indian-African relation. In fact, maybe Pakistan is also going to come. Everybody is coming to have a relation with Africa. But within ourselves, you find on the final analysis that we are having a conversation that is skewed. We are having an experiment that is skewed, in which everybody sees Africa as a potential market that they need to explore. But within the African continent, it's very difficult to even trade with ourselves in terms of regional integration. Because if we trade with ourselves, there's a lot that we can benefit. But you have leaders who are doing forum shopping, who want to go abroad looking for foreign direct investment, who have never put their bases in the correct posture at home in terms of what those engagements is supposed to deliver. So if you ask me, I am not too sure if I can say collectively that this is what this relationship and partnerships have delivered for Africa. Because it appears to me like it's a situation that promises that is going to ring, in which the African leaders do not have the sufficient infrastructure to be able to harvest whatever those relationships are bringing. But it's very difficult to even ship something from Nigeria, from Senegal to Cameroon. Some of the stuff that we are consuming here, as something as basic as the fruit, they go to France from Ivory Coast before they come to Senegal. So these are realities. I think Africa is a very large market. We should be able to put our house in order. And it's not just about doing forum shopping as we have seen. So if I could answer you in a very clear term, I can't say in terms of what those forum shopping has really delivered to Africa. So you have leaders who have really abandoned the core responsibility of fixing their own internal market. And there are lessons that we can learn from this politically and economically. You can learn from European Union. How have they done it? How are we learning from that? Not just doing forum shopping and not really fixing the core issues at all. So I don't really see a collective benefit in terms of this forum shopping. And that is my own Pan-African assessment of all this forum shopping that African leaders are getting involved in.
Okay, Dr. Vines, Arena talked to us about these neo-colonial policies that France has been accused of undertaking in Africa. So looking at France's relationship with the continent, what are the key challenges that France faces in repairing its image and maintaining relevance in a rapidly changing African political landscape?
Well, trust at a political level. It's clear that the juntas in West Africa do not trust France, see France as having been very neo-colonial, intervening in their politics. And so how to restart rebuilding conversations. I am of the view you should not reward men in uniform that have staged unconstitutional changes of government. They should certainly not have red carpet for the French Africa summit in Nairobi, if that's what happens. But they do need to be talked to. I do think that France needs to work out a modern relationship with African partners, both at a continental level, at a regional level, and at a bilateral level. And there are real strengths to the French relationship at a people-to-people level, very deep, on culture, humanitarian support. So those will continue to flourish. And if you listen to the media in France, there's a lot more valid discussion and debate on African issues in my own country here. So, the publics, if they want to be, are better informed of the difficulties, the challenges, and the realities of the African continent. I think France should show innovation on visas and access to France and more broadly to the EU, because Europe's reality in the future is it will need more people-to-people connections and circular migration models, rather than creating Europe in a fortress and building up walls and barriers against Africans coming to engage and partner in Europe, in France, and more broadly. So these are the sorts of things that I think need to be thought through. And it's a step-by-step process, which I think is about bringing more equality. The reality is that the Europe-Africa, France-Africa relationship has been very unequal, has been way too dominated by European stroke French self-interest. And multipolarity is beginning to change that, and that's a good thing. France needs to help African voices be really strengthened in global governance institutions. They are in crisis at the moment, and stronger, coherent African voices will, I think, help the reforms that are needed. It's something that China has been arguing for, but it shouldn't be just a China dialogue. It should be a truly multipolar one that is more equitable. And I think, we need to reform our global governance institutions to be fit for purpose for the world we're now in. They're not working at the moment.
Arena, how is France's approach to Anglophone Africa different from its traditional approaches in Francophone Africa?
So it certainly doesn't have the kind of colonial relationship it has had with Francophone Africa. It's only a large perception, and I really appreciate the panel's kind kind of distinction between your elite and your general public, and how the general public much more freely expresses the socioeconomic living conditions and how the elite makes decisions. And what you're not seeing, and what I think is an opportunity, especially for African leaders to have more agency in these kinds of summits, is to focus on these kinds of developmental questions of the future that include the realistic threat of climate emergencies and the future of green industrialization, while understanding that certain mechanisms cannot continue, with the business as usual approach. And as much as, you have a focus on these kinds of institutionalized engagements, it's important for France and Europe to also remember that when they shift production parts of its economy to developing countries, including African countries, a significant amount of the climate burden will be shifted without any kind of legal reparation. And so at this point, Anglophone African countries really need to behave agentically and to make stronger statements around their Agenda 2063 in terms of how they want to see the next 25 years, 26 years playing out, especially after Kenya is going to be hosting in 2026 the France-Africa Summit. What's also quite interesting is just to see how they're going to start navigating how a youthful population does not tolerate an elitist approach to policymaking, an elitist approach to governance as well.
Okay, and my final question will come to you, Ojewale. What are your thoughts on the potential implications of France's new courting of Anglophone Africa, and how might this affect the dynamics between Francophone and Anglophone countries on the continent? You mentioned earlier that some countries in the western part of the continent are looking at Nigeria suspiciously.
Well, I think what we need to underscore in international relations is that the primary point of consideration is your national interest, irrespective of the multilateral platforms that countries put together. When they show up in such meetings and negotiations, it's all about your national interest first, and then you look at the collective. Chad has always been an established partner with France, and I think that really caught a lot of people unaware. Even me, I couldn't have imagined that Chad was going to pull that, and then Chad has done that. So when you look at the region now, about the only few countries that are moderate now are Senegal, Ivory Coast, and maybe Benin, and maybe one or two other countries if you go to the Central Africa. So I think we have a serious issue at hand. I'm not supporting the view that France should come and dictate the agenda to these countries. But I'm really concerned that in terms of the multilateral platform that we've put together, we can't really do much. And it appears like even though these collective countries have gained independence 60 years ago, strategic decisions about these countries have to still be made outside the shores of this country. And that is what really worried me. And the fact that the world is changing, but I do not see that critical mass of seriousness on the part of the African leader to really position themselves in such a way that they can get the better part of this bargain. I'm not sure it will always be like that, but we have an advantage now to also strike when it is hot. And I'm not really seeing our leaders doing that. So you have somebody like William Ruto excited about moving around, going to Washington, having a climate summit, and then having France-Africa relationship holding. Those things do not necessarily translate to things that improve the quality of life of people. And it's not really about forum shopping, whether it is in West Africa or in this other region.
All right, and that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests, Oluwale Ojewale, the Regional Coordinator, Central Africa Institute for Security Studies, Arina Morrison, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and Dr. Alex Vines, Head of Africa Program, Chatham House. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa from me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.